I guess I had a little too much time on my hands because I began to imagine writing a letter to the gospel writer of Luke, since the lawyers and the judges were all seemed to be caught up in the chambers for the longest time, and we had a lot of time in the pews. I even spent time speaking to John, maybe John speaking to the young man who was on trial about repentance. Surely he needed repentance. So I spent time making up a letter to the gospel writer and expressing my disappointment in this week's lectionary reading, thus the title of the sermon, Dear Luke. I actually did write the letter. I complained about John's character and his message and decided at the last minute not to bore you with the details of this long message of complaining. Sitting in the courtroom and listening to the trial's strange and sometimes confusing maneuvers, I confess I probably got a little angry. Angry at the young man for participating in a senseless act of violence. Angry that Mark was no longer around to enjoy the holidays with his family. Angry that the world seemed to be going on about its business as usual as this wonderful family sat and listened to the testimony about the details of Mark's death. And so I guess I took it out on dear Luke. How dare you? How dare you add more bad news and bad characters like John to this very difficult week of all weeks? Give us a break. Let that guy in jail hear the message of repentance. But unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, we are still in the season of Advent, a time of preparing and waiting when this prophet in a camel hair shirt and dreadlocks drops in on our holiday pleasantries, dripping mud on our neatly decorated Christmas homes and carpets, and showing up at our dinner table with his bad hairdo. To be honest, what is most striking about this character is not his weird hairdo or his unusual eating habits. What is most startling about him, about John, is his courage, his audacity, his uncanny ability to speak truth in the face of power. To the people who lived during Luke's time, the appearance of John the Baptist, the way in which he was described by Luke, would have immediately been recognized as the Old Testament prophet of Elijah, repackaged as John the Baptist. It would have been like today having Abraham Lincoln walk into the Senate chambers with a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation while the Senate was discussing the finance reforms this week. Professor Tom Long has said, it is as if a character from the Old Testament has stepped out of the old and into the pages of the new. Like the old and the character of the new calls us to repentance, calls us to do justice. What is repentance? According to one commentary, repentance is the uncompromising demand for fairness and justice. Generosity and unselfishness are fruits of repentance. Repentance means a spiritual, mental, and physical U-turn. In the Greek, it's called metanoia, which literally means to turn around. It has less to do with spiritual practices and piety and everything to do with how one handles one's resources, as riches, our public service, and our stewardship of not only money but also of our land. Repentance happens when we allow the divine acts to cut off the greed, self-indulgence, egoism, hypocrisy from our lives and throw them into God's unquenchable fire. I think all of us here know that our world is definitely in need of being freed from greed and self-indulgence, for they are robbing us of our livelihood and our land. in intangible ways, right here in West Virginia. This past Monday, David and I traveled to Charleston to a rally against mountaintop removal in Coal Mountain. There were about 300 of us present there to pray, to listen to the stories of people who lived in that area, to stand in solidarity with those whose voices were being drowned out by the passing coal trucks who were blasting their horns constantly while speakers attempted to convey their concern for their land and for the environment. The main speaker for that afternoon, you may have been reading the news this week, was Robert Kennedy Jr. He had walked into the Department of Environmental Protection in order to talk with the regulators and the employees there, and to confront the corruption and the cover-up of the many regulations that have been either ignored or abused. Standing next to me in the cold was a woman who was at least in her 80s, if not older than that. She was acting like she was in her 30s. She was up dancing and joking around. She had a walker so that she could sit down in the event that she got tired, which she used quite frequently. But as soon as Robert Kennedy came into the crowd, he turned and caught sight of her. And he walked over to her and gave her a hug, and they chatted for at least 5 minutes. It was clear that this elderly woman had been to some of these rallies before for environmental protection along with Robert Kennedy. I believe that this elderly woman was doing repentance. Not only a personal repentance, but a collective repentance. She could have stayed home where she would have been warm, and she could have watched the TV news as they covered the story. But instead, she decided that this issue was important enough for her to take time out of her holiday planning to stand up for an important ethical issue that not only affects our communities, but the entire world. John the Baptist's message of repentance interrupts our schedules, demands us to keep one eye on the future and one eye on the ethical conditions of our world, and tells those this week to get out and do something to preserve this lovely country that we have been given. His rhetoric is as unusual and as untamed as the prophet himself. He says if you have 2 coats, then give one of them to someone who has none. And if you have food, feed those who are hungry. And to those who are in the business industry, he tells to be fair. Now, we can hear that. And to the soldiers, he said to be satisfied with your wages. John seems to be telling us, do not confuse sitting on a limb with being the tree or the fruit. We live in a culture of greed and exploitation. No one would argue with that. And so John calls us to be a tree, to be fruits of goodness by sharing our goods and acting with equity and with justice. John knows that God expects people to behave as well as believe. There's a whole lot of behaving going on at Spring Valley Presbyterian Church. Most of this week, many of you went shopping for presents to be given to families in need. Organized the presents into groups that were gender and age specific, and sorted them into piles in the fellowship hall. Many of you spent an enormous amount of time wrapping and trimming presents so that some people, some families in our community will have a better Christmas, knowing that there are people who care for them even though we do not know them.